Uh, Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Peter Worth. I'm the founder, president, CEO of Athena Security Group. We are a next-gen AI-enabled security operations platform, a SIEM, EDR, XDR. We have managed detection and response. And we also, related to the topic at hand, we have a lab where we are doing preeminent AI research in the field of cybersecurity. In particular, we're doing research relative to intrusion detection systems, the training of threat intelligence language models, and also relative to the training of language models. We have published probably the industry standard benchmarking platform for language models across a variety of use cases that are, both relevant and pertinent to day-to-day security operations. Before I started Athena, I was a CISO and ran security and compliance for a preeminent benefits consulting firm. We served the Fortune 500. We served many of the largest banks in the world, many of the largest telecommunications companies in the world, and other major Fortune 500 players. In serving that community, cybersecurity and compliance from a regulatory standpoint and a legislative standpoint, privacy and data security were all very relevant and very critically important to that community, and that really informed the sort of basic design principles upon which Athena Security Group has built its platform. Um, and What I wanted to talk about today was something a little bit different than what we're seeing being talked about and discussed with respect to AI and cybersecurity. There's a lot of talk that's been and a lot of articles and a lot of noise about AI increasing the velocity and also the severity relative to attack vectors in the modern enterprise. And I think there's a plethora of data related to that shows that attacks are increasing in speed and also in severity and scope, right? I mean, the good guys or the bad guys are using AI, right? Just like everybody else. And so that, of course, looks, forces from a cyber defense standpoint for you to kind of rethink how it is that you're kind of managing your security operations framework. And that's really the foundation upon which we've built our platform. And we think about AI in a very, in a very sort of methodological way that I want to speak about a little bit here. Because we are one of the preeminent AI cybersecurity labs, we are working with the technology and we are, intimately familiar of what these models are good at analyzing and doing and what they're relatively weak at analyzing and doing. And if you kind of are familiar with, the larger cybersecurity players, whether it's Palo Alto or Cisco or even now Google and some of the other cloud providers that are kind of entering the fray of cybersecurity, they are, kind of pushing their AI capabilities, but, they're kind of loose on details in terms of what use cases they're really good at solving for and which ones they're relatively weak at. And so what we have for people that are CISOs or sitting kind of on the wall, as I like to say, from a cyber defense perspective, you have kind of this sort of massive market push around automating kind of agentic AI solutions in the modern SOC, and there's a ton of investment that's moving towards pushing these sort of automated agentic frameworks to somehow be the panacea for the fact that your SOC has a bunch of fragmented applications and the data is disparate, and there's a ton of alerts coming through that you have difficulty sifting through. Somehow AI is going to basically just clean all that up and handle everything for you. And really, what I'm here today to tell you is that that's a myth. Um, and there is we have a sort of more of a reserved approach in terms of how to implement AI in what I call the vSOC. And really, what I want to talk about today is I want to root the discussion around intelligence more broadly within sort of a philosophical framework. One that's a little bit different than what you see commonplace and day to day in certainly in the cybersecurity software market. But also when you start talking about reason and intelligence upon which, really artificial intelligence is predicated, and I'm at the tail end of a PhD, so I'm in computer science departments, and again, running Athena Labs, which is publishing research in this area, there's a lot of talk about the capabilities and the reasoning, quote unquote, capabilities of these tools. But yet there's 2,000 years of philosophical discourse about what reason actually means that's completely absent from the online literature and the marketing material. And that's what I really want to cover very briefly here. I am not a philosopher. I have studied enough philosophy to be dangerous. We will talk more broadly about that within the context of Western philosophy and why philosophy generally can inform these decisions about how best to use AI in a vSOC, a virtual SOC, right? And that's really the intent and the focus and the scope of what we're covering today. So, this talks about what's happening in the market, right? Threat velocity is increasing. And really, I think the metric upon which all of this comes to a head is MTTR, which is the mean time to respond. And this is something which is we are laser focused on. And if you're running a SOC or you're protecting a kind of a major enterprise digital infrastructure and you're not looking at the MTTR metric, how long it's taking you to respond, you're probably asking for a little bit of trouble because the bad guys are getting better, quicker, and faster. And if you're not if you don't have the tools and the system infrastructure behind you to be able to respond quickly, you're really at a very, very significant disadvantage. This chart talks a little bit about how that gap is kind of, between, how fast people are responding and how the bad actors are moving, how fast they're moving. It talks, this shows you clearly the trends, and it's certainly they're getting better and faster as we move forward, and that's really one of the reasons why a lot of folks are thinking about really considering retooling, which is very, very important. And so, one of the premier principles upon which modern security is based is actually zero trust. In fact, we have one of the preeminent sort of researchers and backers of zero trust that's actually part of our management team and our leadership team, Dr. Chase Cunningham. He's actually in the background here. He can sort of virtually wave. And when you think about zero trust, while it's extremely difficult to actually implement well, and Chase talks a lot about that in his podcasts and online, it's a very simple construct, right? It's basically like trust no one, right? And trust no connectivity at all, right? And then basically you build up trust criteria over time based upon your knowledge of the infrastructure, your knowledge of connections that are incoming, and you train your network infrastructure and your cyber defense platforms over time by informing them as to what can be trusted, right? That's basically the foundation principle upon which zero trust is based. Now, interestingly, and probably not coincidentally, right, you have a very big push in the Western philosophical paradigm over the last, let's say, 50 years, coming out of also Europe and also the West, and it's called postmodernism, right? And it's sort of the tail end of what happened after modernism, right? Postmodernism, but also what happened after sort of the Enlightenment philosophical trends, which were based upon objective truth, right? It's this sort of overturning, right? Copernican science and saying, but not theology, but really we can rest on science and empiricism. And through science, we can discover what the nature of knowledge and objective truth is. That was great and served us very well through the scientific revolution until over the last 40 or 50 years, where philosophers have kind of woken up to the fact that not everything that's been pushed from an objective and empirical kind of scientific perspective is in fact true, right? And if you look at sort of the foundation principles upon physics over the last, 100 years, really, with quantum mechanics, much of the determinism and objective realism upon which physics has been based for centuries has actually kind of faded away. And postmodernism, in many respects, is very much aligned to the principles of zero trust. And again, I don't think that that is coincidental. When you look at Kant, who's one of the preeminent Enlightenment philosophers, right? He actually has, a treatise on morality and a treatise on metaphysics, and he sort of sets the stage for empiricism and the scientific revolution from a philosophical standpoint. He's probably one of the most influential philosophers after Aristotle in the Western tradition, right? And he actually has much of his philosophical framework, not to get too much into details, is about the faculties of the mind. And he distinguishes between faculties of the mind, and he does that to both establish the rational principles upon which morality is based, and also to try and establish how one can ascertain knowledge and truth, right? Not necessarily based on empiricism and not necessarily based on skepticism, but sort of a middle ground. And really, what he divides the world or the faculties of the mind into, again, very broadly here, is faculties of understanding, right? Which is the ability to sort of analyze and collate and correlate information, right? Synthesize that information. And then the mind's ability to cast a judgment, right? Which is the ability to say, okay, based upon the analysis that's been done and, the mind's capabilities of ascertaining the facts of a certain situation or experience, there then is a process by which a human being makes a decision, a determinative faculty, what he calls judgment. And in fact, he has a whole treatise on judgment. What I will point out here is again, and again, I don't think this is very coincidental, is that if you look at this alignment generally with the faculties of the mind, while you have an industry that is pushing, very much pushing artificial intelligence, right? Intelligence as sort of this kind of grossly over, encompassing framework upon which humans can effectively be replaced, right? And that is a very self-serving principle, right? Really, what you have is you have tools that are falling very much in the former category of understanding, capability, and analysis, not necessarily judgment. In fact, there's been much studies that's been done, many studies that have been done fairly recently that point out that in fact, a lot of these AI tools lack basic judgment skills in certain situations. One that was just done by, I think, some Stanford and some Harvard guys, something around chaos. I forget the name of the article that talks a little bit about if you basically unleash agentic AI over the course of about 2 or 3 weeks, they found out that these agentic autonomous agents were making all sorts of poor decisions. And based upon those poor decisions, we're coming to all sorts of crazy conclusions. And that's not, that is a characteristic of AI as it stands today, is that effectively it is very weak in the judgment category and very strong in the understanding and the analytical category. In fact, if you look at Jan LeCun, who's one of the preeminent AI researchers in the field, he actually comes from my alma mater in NYU. He was at Meta for a long time. He just raised $1 billion. And his fundamental premise in his new company is, in fact, that the current models are limited in their domain because ultimately they're processing digital information, even if it's multimodal, right? Even if it's video and text and audio, it's still digital, and they don't have a true understanding of the world as it stands, which human beings do. And this speaks to this sort of lack of capabilities in the category of judgment. This is not talked about at all in the AI literature, certainly not by the AI companies. And I really want to draw attention to this distinction here, because while it's a fundamental philosophical principle in the Western philosophical tradition, it really informs the discussion around what AI as it stands today is capable of doing and how it should be used versus what it's weak at doing and how it should not be used. If you look at how best to optimize these tools, given that they're very good at analysis and understanding, but not so great at judgment, right? You can see there's a simple curve that you can spot out here that talks about, the AI utility, particularly of these autonomous agents, which everybody's very enamored with and are extremely powerful. I mean, we're looking at them as well and doing R&D in that area. But as the risk and the criticality of decisions increases, right? That's really where you need to start curtailing and putting guardrails around what these agentic AI and autonomous agents are capable and should be capable of doing. In fact, when you look at sort of the Department of Defense and the big blowup they just had with Anthropic over the last couple of weeks, it was directed specifically at this issue. The Department of Defense wanted the AI to basically give them the keys and be able to run unencumbered. And Anthropic, to its credit, basically drew the line and said, no, we want to make sure that there are some certain controls in place, lo and behold, the administration got very upset at that, and that'll go into a court case. We'll have some interesting results, but this is a very important curve to keep in mind as you're looking at optimizing AI, certainly in the cybersecurity domain, but in other domains as well. The same thing always holds. And so this is a good way of thinking about how to optimize AI, again, in a virtual security operations center and cyber defense, but also generally across enterprises. I think these truths hold. Humans for decision-basing capability, where there's a cultural aspect to it, where there's a human aspect to it, where there may be a governance aspect to it, where there are complex, subtle, nuanced based issues that may not be hardwired into, true or false type of situations. And then the AI is for mass analysis of data and to, kind of yield conclusions across domains, right? It's very good at analyzing vast amounts of data. And so when you look at AI within the context of a virtual SOC, you look at it for data aggregation and normalization. This is a very good task. Pattern recognition, picking up certain patterns across the security operations landscape. When you're looking at enriching and correlating data from various aspects of the security operations, or when you look at taking the cyber threat intelligence data and then sort of incorporate that into alerts that that are coming up within the context of your enterprise, and of course summarizing and drafting kind of next steps or recommended risk mitigation actions and stuff like that, right? AI is really, really capable and competent in that, can save all sorts of time. And then, of course, where humans are critical, right? In this balance of, how should I act on an alert? Is it in fact a false positive, or is it something that I should do a little bit more research on? While in many cases, the AI agentic stuff may be in a good position to do that, not necessarily in all cases. And if you automate those tasks, even if it's, wrong 5 or 6% of the time, you add that up over the course of several months. And where does that leave you? Right? Particularly if you don't have the ability to roll back certain changes, or if it could have other business impacts as well if you're shutting down servers that you shouldn't shut down. There's a couple of incidents over the last couple of months, and AI has had that type of impact on some of the cloud providers. Amazon's been in the news along that stuff as well. They've had several outages related to the fact that, some of these agents went ahead and made some decisions and did some stuff that they really shouldn't. And of course, when you get into sort of governance and ethics and sort of, more human elements or jurisdictional and legal elements, these are areas where, AI is really not very well suited for. Again, from an analysis perspective, yeah, you want to actually get some data from the AI tools around what the kind of, compliance or jurisdictional landscape might look like, but you would be ill-advised to let the AI agents automate some of those decisions, because you're going to be held liable for that stuff. And there's plenty of court cases that have come up over the last year or two that reflect the liability still being in the hands of companies, despite the fact that some of these AI agents may have created some of the content or made some of those decisions. Guardrails, they call it human in the loop operational models. This is very much akin to and aligned with the strategy that we're implementing. There's a couple of details here when you look at alert triage, which is kind of a very kind of core use case for security operations center. You get an alert that comes from a certain place in the security operations landscape. You're taking a look at that, and then based upon that, you are understanding the context. You are enriching that alert potentially to try and see what the threat landscape looks like relative to that. Where that attacker, if in fact it is a true positive, where they might be hitting next, what systems they may have impacted, right? And then you have kind of an orchestrator to be able to say, okay, based upon that alert, what should I actually do? What are my next steps? And that's really where that human element comes in, right? And so there's this combination of, they call it a human in the loop, but ultimately you've got a human that's driving, making the determinative and sort of judgment determinations around a given alert that comes through, and how to kind of work it through the workflow in that SOC, and how basically to act on it based upon the information that the AI agents and the AI tools are providing. And you could see here, as you kind of look at the detection and response timeline and use case in general, which is a lot of what happens in the core of security operations centers, kind of day-to-day operational blocking and tackling. You can see there's this kind of interreaction based upon this type of triage where you're leveraging these AI tools for analysis and aggregation and correlation and enrichment. But ultimately, you want humans to be able to drive what decisions are being made. And if, in fact, there's some action that needs to be taken in that enterprise to be able to quarantine a server or block IPs or potentially take servers offline, those are decisions you really want a human in the loop. And then there's some other decisions that, based upon alert signatures, you want to automate certain capabilities like blocking for malicious scanning and stuff like that. Those are easy for AI agents to be set up to, set up those business rules, so to speak. But again, there's this sort of hand to glove interaction between the human and the AI tools to be able to optimize how you're running the SOC and making sure that you're making good decisions on a day-to-day basis. Um, and this kind of looks again about how does it kind of a metaphysical approach and from Kant's perspective of understanding versus judgment, how does that map to how you optimize the use of AI within a vSOC? And it turns out there's really very good alignment there, and I think that is based upon the fact that Kant did a very good job of identifying the core faculties, right, in order to establish the grounds of metaphysics for us over the last several hundred years. But then also, AI, as it's developing, really the core capabilities it has are really around the analysis and the understanding capability, and it really lacks on the judgment side. And there's a lot of work to be done to improve that area. Um, so when you look at optimizing this, there's sort of an evolutionary, an evolution of sort of the traditional stock, which is, very difficult to scale, given the pace that AI has kind of introduced into the cyber defense landscape. And you have this sort of full automation approach that's being pushed very hard, specifically by the AI vendors and a lot of folks that are investing a lot of money in full AI automation. And then you have a more measured approach that really we're trying to both adopt and also be a proponent of in terms of the kind of messaging that we're pushing to the market, which is you want to build AI, advanced AI capability into your platform, but you want to use it in the right place and you want to be measured and you want to make sure that the judgments are being made properly by very good security analysts that sit on top of the orchestration of managed detection and response on a day-to-day basis in a modern SOC. So, kind of there you have it, a little interesting foray into kind of the world of philosophy. And as it turns out, there's a lot of applicability there relative to where we are from an artificial intelligence standpoint today, getting through the hype in terms of what the AI companies and a lot of the next gen cybersecurity companies are pushing. And really, if you're on the wall, so to speak, and sort of day to day CISO cyber defense, what the optimal approach you should be looking to implement. And of course, if you have any questions about any of this stuff or you want to look more into detail about our system and how we've implemented it, feel free to talk to us and we're available. And thanks very much for everybody's time today. And I don't know that we have any questions available, but I will open it up for questions if anybody has anything briefly. And I think we came right under the 25-minute mark. I think that's good for everybody. Thanks very much. I think Laura and Christian, we can close this out. And we look forward to doing this again soon. All right. Thanks, everybody.